It should be no surprise that many of our nation's race-related firsts are celebrated today as cultural landmarks. However, one man who went above and beyond the norm to achieve feats that potentially no other individual could be capable of, all in the face of some of the most brutal conditions one could be subjected to on the field of battle, is more obscure of a figure than I'd like. So today, we're talking about Chew-Een Lee, the first Asian American officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. Lee was born on January 21, 1926, in California. The oldest of 6 siblings, the first hint of what Lee's career would eventually become was his keeping up with current events regarding the Sino-Japanese War back in China. The pictures and witness accounts of Japanese war crimes like the Nanking Massacre had a profound effect on young Lee. He was too young for the military when news of Pearl Harbor arrived in 1941, but was drafted upon turning 18 in 1944 and opted to join the U.S. Marine Corps. He believed that many young Asian Americans avoided the Marines and personally identified with their first-to-fight ethos, so he sought to challenge this stereotype through military service. Lee was sent to the Marine Corps' San Diego Recruit Depot for training. From there, he expected to be shipped out to the front line like the rest of his class, many of whom ended up on a little island called Iwo Jima, but was instead to find that his World War service would instead be spent elsewhere. He was kept stateside to learn the Japanese language, and then forced to continue his in-country duties by staying to teach it to future recruits. This only further demoralized Lee. Given his reasons for signing on with the Corps, he understandably wanted a combat posting. Still, he soldiered on and went back to college to finish his education while he was in country, most notably joining the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC. If any of you were confused why some of your fellow students show up to class in military uniform, this is the program they're in. Through this program and his service, Lee was already being selected for officer training by the end of the war. Feeling, in his own words, quite frankly ashamed to have his wartime service pass undecorated, Lee stayed in the Corps after the war, joining the first class of post-war Marine officer trainees. After serving his commission, Lee spent time in China. Interestingly, his Chinese heritage did not help him much here, as he did not speak much Mandarin. Regardless, though, he wouldn't have to wait long to get his chance on the battlefield. Again in Lee's words, I was enough of a student of history to know that it wouldn't be long before there would be another war. He was right, as in 1950, an American-led UN peacekeeping force was dispatched to aid nationalist South Korea in their fight against communist North Korea. First Lieutenant Chew-Een Lee was assigned to command the 1st Platoon of B Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. Completely reorganized from scratch with career soldiers, reservists, and new trainees, Lee made the best of the situation by drilling his men continuously over the 2-week sea voyage to Korea, ensuring they were the best trained men in his company. This regimen would pay off, first shown at Incheon in September and November. Here, Lee fought the North Koreans and their Chinese allies on the push northwards. His first major act of heroism came when his men were attacked by a group of Chinese in the Battle of Sudong Gorge on the night of November 2nd. Lee single-handedly advanced on the enemy positions to identify them for his men, distracting them by shouting in Chinese before attacking with his own weapons, eventually forcing them to retreat all on his own. For these actions, he was awarded the Navy Cross. Okay, here I must pause the alliteration in the titles for just a moment, because there is simply no making light of what happened at the Chew-Een Reservoir. The conditions that the 1st Marine Division, Lee included, faced here was nothing short of horrific, potentially the worst in American military history. After being pulled away from the fighting around Incheon, the 1st Marines were sent all the way around the peninsula to the opposite side to advance deep into North Korea as winter set in throughout November. Little did they or anyone else on the American side know that at that moment, hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened Communist Chinese troops were slamming into the advancing Americans. The Marines were surrounded by overwhelming numbers at the Chew-Een Reservoir, but managed to fight their way back south through the teeth of a vicious Korean winter. And First Lieutenant Chew-Een Lee would be the tip of the spear for this movement. Beginning the retreat after several days of hard fighting under cover of night on December 2nd, First Lieutenant Lee and his platoon were forced to go cross-country due to the Chinese roadblocks. He led his men single file, in the dark, and in negative 20 degrees Celsius temperatures, battling fatigue and cold more than the enemy. Through his own efforts, Lee kept his exhausted men moving to outflank and overwhelm the Chinese blocking the road, allowing for the force to reach the halfway point at Fox Hill, also saving the company of Marines that had been surrounded there. He received the Silver Star for this, though many of his men said he should have gotten the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, this would be the end of his time in Korea. He was wounded, for the third time, on December 8th, proving serious enough to end his Korean War service. Lee eventually returned to active duty in the Corps, seeing his next major service in the Vietnam War in 1965 as part of the first major Marine Corps deployment in-country. He served as the Combat Intelligence Officer for the 3rd Marine Division, reading and analyzing foreign language documents captured in the field. There isn't too much of note to discuss for Lee's tour here, except for his opinion on the quite heavy and bulky protective flak jacket that was issued to troops in this time, as every Vietnam vet I hear about always seems to have their own opinions on it. In Lee's case, he uses his as a seat cushion, because that area was the only part of his body he was actually worried about getting hit. Lee retired in 1968 as a major and worked in the private sector afterwards. First for the New York Life Insurance Company, then for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. He kept himself involved in the Corps through various former comrades from his time in the service. Chew-Een Lee died on March 3, 2014, aged 88. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Chew-Een Lee's story has become well known in history circles as a total hard-ass of an officer who ended up earning the respect of his fellow Marines through his personal bravery under fire and the clear effectiveness of his methods. His status as the first Asian American officer has, I feel, been somewhat overshadowed by this due to it happening before the advent of the Civil Rights Movement. But regardless, Lee's embodiment of the aggressive spirit of the Marine Corps is widely celebrated, through which he proves without a shadow of a doubt that the weak and diminutive stereotype of Asian Americans is entirely false.